Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center. I'm Mike Gousha, and with me today is the director of the Marquette University Law School Poll, Charles Franklin. And Charles, we're here today to talk about a new national survey of public attitudes toward the U.S. Supreme Court, but we're doing something a little different. We've done this twice in the past, annual surveys, but we're doing more surveying of the court this year. Tell us about it.
Yeah, we're expanding that. We did large national surveys in September of 2019 and again in 2020. But this year we're expanding it from 1 time a year to 6 times a year. So about every other month we'll be doing a poll that addresses questions about the Supreme Court, about the law, about related legal issues, and about the way politics more generally affects the court and affects people's perceptions of it. So it's important to understand we're not trying to use the public to create a scorecard for whether decisions are right or wrong or who's the most popular or unpopular justice. What we're trying to do is say that the court has become enmeshed in national politics in a growing way over the last 6 years or so. And the way that politics that's played out in the White House and in the Senate, as well as in the Supreme Court, has become a more important issue of American politics. And that's why how voters feel about that, how they perceive the court and the issues surrounding it, whether it's nominations or the size of the court, all of those things are things that we'll be looking at in this poll and then going forward. We'll also be pretty much the only poll that polls about the court on such a frequent basis. Most polling is done once a year about the court, the way we've been doing in the past. But we want to expand that and be able to see what's going on in a much greater frequency.
How do we go about this survey? Tell us a little bit about the details, when we were in the field, the sample size, and the methodology we used.
This represents a shift from the long-standing Marquette Law School polls of Wisconsin, which have been done on the telephone with live interviewers and will continue to be done that way going forward. But for the national polling, we're using online surveys. What sets these surveys apart is that they draw a random sample of addresses, places that mail gets delivered to. Then a letter goes to people at a sample of those addresses, inviting them to take part in these surveys. And once recruited into what's called a panel, they are interviewed online, but they're interviewed in a way that only one person can be invited and answer that questionnaire. You can't answer it 5 or 10 times. And it's based on a random sample to begin with, the same way the telephone polls are based on a random sample of phone numbers. And so those are real advantages to doing this kind of work online. And finally, because people read the question on their phone or tablet or laptop, the questions can sometimes be a little more complicated than what you can really read over the phone. Now, we try not to make the questions very complicated, but that's another advantage of doing it online. For this month's poll, we interviewed 1,010 adults, 18 and over, in all 50 states, national sample. We were interviewing from July 16th through the 26th, about a 10-day field period. And that has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.9 percentage points.
What we've seen historically, Charles, is that the public generally has pretty favorable opinions of the Supreme Court. So I guess we'll begin there to see if that trend continues.
Yeah, that continues in our data and was there in the previous 2 annual polls as well. In this one, approval of the court overall is 60% approve, 39 disapprove. That's pretty high. It's a little higher than Joe Biden at 58% approval, and it's a lot higher than Congress at 33%. I always feel like we're kind of beating up on Congress when we ask about them because they always score low on that. But the court is doing pretty well. On the other hand, that is down by 6 points from 66% approval a year ago. So there has been some shift down. It happens that the Gallup poll came out a week or so ago with their annual Supreme Court survey. They have overall approval down in the low 50s, so a little bit lower than we do. But just like we found, they see a bit of a decline in approval of the court over time. Probably the difference here is because a telephone survey makes it easier for people to say, I don't know about approval, whereas an online survey, people can skip the question, but almost everybody, only 1% skips the question online, but you might get 5 to 10% saying don't know in a telephone survey. So I think that gap between the low 50s and 60% that we have is probably a methods effect. You see that for presidential approval as well.
So in our poll, we're down 6 points. Is that largely Republicans who are not as happy with the court, or is it Democrats who are not as happy with the court?
It's really pretty striking that it's a substantial drop in Republicans. One of the findings we have this year is that there's almost no difference in approval from Democrats to Republicans. They're both in the high 50s of approval. But a year ago, Republicans were at about 80% approval of the court, and they've fallen all the way down to the high 50s. Democrats and independents have barely budged over the last year. And again, this is something Gallup found as well, that they don't see that. They didn't mention whether it had changed across parties from last time, but it's clear for us that the big change here is in Republican views of the court. One other thing, our poll last year was completed the day before Justice Ginsburg died. And so since that time, there's actually been another justice added to the court, nominated by President Trump, confirmed by a Republican Senate. And despite that having a bigger majority of Republican-appointed justices, it's Republican approval that fell off pretty sharply this year.
And of course, we could all speculate on the reasons for that, but we won't speculate. We'll just let the numbers speak for themselves. And trust amongst the public is also still pretty strong for the court.
The way we and others typically ask this question is, which of the three branches of the federal government, the court, the presidency, the Congress, do you trust the most? The court almost always ends up at the top of that heap. They were at 58% this year. They were 59% last year. Very little change in that most trusted institution.
So the public has confidence in the court. The question might be asked, based on what? And the poll finds, and this is not a new finding, but the knowledge of people about the court is still pretty iffy. And we look again at even recognition of the justices, whether people have even heard of the justices. Right. What do we find, generally speaking, Charles?
I think the big takeaway here is that if you're really into the courts, if you listen to the fights over nominations or judgeships in Congress or on podcasts about the courts and interest group talks, you would think everybody is intensely interested in and aware of the court, and that's just not true. Now, it's fair to say that that's not true about Congress or specific legislation either. Some set of people pay attention to those in real detail and really do care a lot about them. But an awful lot of us would be hard-pressed, me included, to tell you details of a particular piece of legislation that's going through. And I might be able to name more members of Congress than some people might, but you'd put me on the spot if you asked me to name the senator from Idaho right at the moment. I'd have to work at that. So in that sense, I want to stress that it's not unusual that people don't have encyclopedic knowledge of the court. But what our data show is they clearly have less knowledge about the court than they typically have about U.S. senators, and certainly less than they have about a president, where almost everybody has some opinion and some knowledge of the president. So that's the first thing to appreciate. When we ask people how important is the appointment of the next justice to you, about 51% say that's very important to them. But that leaves about 49% who may think it's somewhat important or not important. But then really, I thought one of the most interesting findings was the question of presidents of which party appointed a majority of the justices on the court. And we gave people the options. Definitely Democrats appointed a majority, probably Democrats did, probably Republicans appointed a majority, definitely Republicans appointed a majority. Well, there's a 6-3 Republican majority right now with Amy Coney Barrett's addition to the court last year. But we found only 30% of our sample said Republicans definitely had a majority. Now, about 75% altogether said it was definitely or probably a Republican majority. So that's where the balance is. But even so, it was around 30% or a little bit less that said, yeah, it's either definitely or probably a Democratic majority. Well, it hadn't been a Democratic majority for a long, long time now. But that important piece of information has not filtered through to a not trivial segment of the population.
And how, Charles, does that affect the views of the court? The fact that people are apparently not getting that information that they need.
Yeah, it has several effects, but one is that among Republicans, if overall about 30% say it's definitely a Republican majority on the court, among Republicans, it's only 16% of Republicans that say it's definitely a Republican majority. And that's kind of stunning, really, after 4 years of talking about appointments. It's all about the judges. The year before that, in 2016, we saw the Republican Senate block the appointment of Merrick Garland, which would have tilted the majority in a Democratic direction. So despite all the emphasis that has gone into controlling appointments, President Trump having 3 appointments in his 4-year term, nevertheless, that news hasn't sunk in completely across the party spectrum, but perhaps especially among some group of Republicans. And maybe not surprisingly, those Republicans that mistakenly believe there's still definitely or probably a Democratic majority, and that's 30% of Republicans, have a very negative view of the court, whereas other Republicans that correctly know they control the court, or at least have an appointed majority on the court, are much more positive about the court. So misinformation matters that way.
One question about the Chief Justice, John Roberts. I was struck by how many people had never heard of the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah.
It's not a small number.
No, it's not. We've asked this question to invite people to tell us if they haven't heard these names. We do say some people have heard more about some justices than others, but people know we're asking about justices of the court. And we say, is this someone you've never heard of at all, have heard of but don't know enough to have an opinion of, or do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of them? And when we do that, Justice Roberts ends up in the middle of the 9 justices with only about 42% who say they know enough to have an opinion of him. Of those, there's on balance a positive view of the Chief Justice, but it's still a minority, 42% or so, that have an opinion about him at all, think they know enough to have an opinion. And he's not a newcomer to the court at this point either.
No, he's not. Interestingly, he fares better with Democrats than Republicans in this poll?
One of the surprising findings we have is that there are clear partisan differences despite this lack of knowledge and information in detail. People do still, nonetheless, seem to take enough cues from their political leaders to line things up about right. So among Republicans, respondents, those folks are more positive about 5 of the 6 Republican-appointed justices compared to Democrats who are less positive about them. And vice versa, among Democrats, Democrats are more positive about all of the Democratic presidential appointments than Republicans are. But Chief Justice Roberts is the one exception to that. Better liked, higher favorabilities among Democrats, and about a dead even split among Republicans.
And of course, appointed by President George W. Bush.
Yes,
yeah.
I should say a
No,
Republican appointee.
Let's talk about something that's been in the news a fair amount, even a commission looking at this issue, and that's whether or not the court should be expanded. Some people call it court packing. We asked about that. How does the public feel about that?
They're fairly evenly divided. It's about 48% in favor of expansion, 51 or so opposed to expansion. But here there's a really big and symmetric partisan split. Republicans split about 1/4 in favor, 3/4 opposed, and Democrats are almost exactly the reverse, 3/4 in favor, 1/4 opposed. Independents are fairly evenly split, but it's about 44 to 55 or so among independents, with more of them opposed. So we've seen this in the previous year's polling as well. Fairly divided public on it, but one where the party divisions are really quite sharp.
And another thing that's been a fair amount of discussion, we'll get to something a little more specific in a moment, but this is the whole idea of whether justices should take into consideration who controls, which party controls the presidency, or which party controls the Senate. That should be taken into consideration when they make a decision to retire. Did that sit well with the public? Do they agree with that idea?
No, in general, they don't agree with it. By 28 to 72, people say 28% say the justice should consider party control, but a much bigger 72% say they should not. Now, this is not a question that most people have stayed up at night thinking about, but a number of left-leaning op-ed pieces and opinion pieces have argued that with the uncertainty of an appointment if Republicans took back control of the Senate, that those folks believe Breyer, who's the oldest justice at 82, should step down now while there's a Democratic president and Democratic control of the Senate. Clearly, without knowing what we're talking about, a sort of 3-to-1 majority opposes that, 72 to 28. But we asked half the sample just the straight question: should justices consider party control when deciding to retire? We didn't provide any more information than that. But for the other half of the sample, we had a fairly lengthy lead-in that said Justice Stephen Breyer is 82 years old and the oldest member of the court. He was appointed by President Clinton. Some Democrats have urged him to retire now while Democrats control the presidency and Senate. And then we repeat the last of the question just like before. Do you think justices should consider the control of the party? So there people get cued into what is it we're talking about here and why is it relevant? It's a real world thing. Yeah. Interestingly, for Democrats, support for that strategic retirement goes up to a little over 50%, though it was considerably below 50% without that extra information. But it also raised support for strategic retirement among independents and Republicans as well. I think tying that decision to political advantage made people across the party spectrum a bit more willing to see this as a political game of when to retire, but it boosted it more among Democrats where there was an obvious direct party interest in it.
Charles, one of the features of our past polls and a feature again of this poll is looking at cases that have been decided by the court. And we looked at, 6 of them that were decided in June or July. And give us a sense of the kinds of cases we're talking about here.
So these were cases that were, relatively speaking, the leading headline on the day that they were handed down, though they vary in how much salience they have among the public and how much people are aware of those cases. So one is a California decision on a California law requiring donors to disclose their donations. One is an Arizona voting rights bill. One is the NCAA and its antitrust issues. One is sometimes called the angry cheerleader, a cheerleader from Pennsylvania who said impolite things on Snapchat and whether she had a free speech right to say those outside of school, and in fact, outside of school hours and off school grounds. Then we also asked about the Affordable Care Act, and I may have missed one in that list.
Pennsylvania, Philadelphia.
Oh, yes, of course. Catholic Social Services of Philadelphia declined to place foster children with same-sex couples, though it provided other services to same-sex couples. Philadelphia had a rule saying you can't have this city contract if you don't serve all people. And so this raised a religious belief question versus a anti-discrimination question. The court ruled narrowly but unanimously, I believe, or at least almost unanimously. There was a little bit of difference of opinion, but in any case, ruled with the Catholic Charities on this question. But that just represents one of a continuing set of religious liberty issues that have been coming before the court in recent years and are likely to keep coming before the court as well.
How much awareness did the public have of these cases? Because some of them, the NCAA antitrust case, certainly the Affordable Care Act case, just to name two, received a lot of media attention. How much awareness up there?
There's a lot of range. On the California donation disclosure, that was the low end. It was in the mid-30s. 37 or 38%, who said they'd heard enough to have an opinion about that decision. At the high end, the Affordable Care Act was at 60% who knew enough to have an opinion. And the angry cheerleader got 58%. I think maybe the subject matter might have driven that one a little bit. But the others were in the middle, typically in the 40-something% range of awareness. And so I think the takeaway from this is that some cases, even pretty visible cases, struggle to get out of the 30% range of awareness. And of course, if we had asked about some of the obscure cases, we would have found almost nobody had heard about some of those rulings. But even in these most visible cases of the Affordable Care Act, an issue of broad public policy and longstanding political debate, or the cheerleader case in which there's a sort of human interest element to it, that maybe stands out. Even those broke into the high 50s or 60, but they didn't reach the high 60s or the 70s. So, you know, this is the case that occasionally you'll get a landmark decision that practically everybody does learn about. But for the most part, I think we're looking at somewhere between 30% of the public and maybe 60 or so percent that become aware of specific cases.
For people who were aware of those cases, did they support what the court had done, or did they disagree with it? Was there a clearly held view on that?
I think this is pretty interesting that on all but one of these cases, a plurality favored the court's decision and less than a plurality opposed it. Or put another way, of those with an opinion, a majority favored all these decisions but one. One of those was a dead even split. But what we do find is that partisans line up on what you might call the correct side of the issue. So on the decisions that went in a conservative direction, Republicans favored those rulings more than Democrats. Where decisions went in a liberal direction, Democrats favored them more. The exceptions were the less partisan issues. The cheerleader case is a good example, and also the NCAA ruling, where majorities favored the rulings. Democrats were a little more favorable than Republicans, but even among Republicans, there was a majority that favored those rulings.
So are we seeing, Charles, the public increasingly viewing the court through the prism of raw partisan politics, or through the framing by news media that plays to a certain political audience?
I think that the political framing is something that has been increasing in recent years. I'm tempted to say recent decades, as sort of a long-term change. In preparing this survey and writing the questions about the cases, I read literally dozens of news stories about these decisions so that I could word the questions to reflect the way the news media reports on these decisions. So it'd be in terms familiar to people rather than, say, the legalese of the formal decision. And in doing that, I was struck at how many of these stories within at least the first 3 paragraphs, or maybe 4, make a reference to the division on the court either in ideological terms, the 3 liberals versus the 6 conservatives, or even the 3 Democratic appointed judges or the 3 Republican appointed or the 6 Republican appointed justices. And you're seeing that explicitly as part of these stories. On the one hand, those are true facts, and it's the way we talk about and debate the court more than maybe we did in the past. But there's perhaps not as much of an outline of what the legal question was. How is this a church versus state issue? Or how is this pitting one state or another against another? Or how is this about the reach of regulatory law versus the limits of it? You could imagine a lot of these decisions being described in those terms, but I'm seeing quite a lot of coverage that emphasizes either party or ideology in explaining the splits. A side point is some of these cases were decided unanimously or nearly unanimously and included people of both wings of the court and the majority. And this year we had quite a few cases that included kind of odd couples in the majority, the 3 liberals plus, see, now I'm doing it, but the 3 liberal justices plus a couple or 3 or even 4 of the conservative justices. We saw quite a few decisions this year that went that way. And that is pointed out in the news coverage of it. But I do think that people are reaching, again, as I just said, as I just did, for the shorthand of ideology or partisanship of the appointing president. And that often gets even worse of a shorthand to call them Republican or Democratic judges, something that Chief Justice Roberts has pushed back forcefully against in saying we don't wear red robes or blue robes. And it's also something that Justice Breyer gave a major speech this spring at Harvard, pushing back on the notion that judging is a partisan affair. But I think in this, those 2 justices are running against some pretty strong headwinds where other political actors, whether it's presidents or the senators, see it to their advantage to frame the issues of the court in partisan terms and to fight over appointments in partisan terms. And that makes it very hard to set those partisan battles aside once the justice is seated on the court and is rendering decisions.
So you're the pollster. I'll give you a chance here at the end to tell me what your big takeaway from this survey is.
Yeah. I think the easy one is simply the court remains a pretty well-respected body, and that benefits them for getting the benefit of the doubt from the public more broadly. But we have to recognize that while elites in Washington treat the court as the most exciting game in town, that just isn't true for a lot of the public. There's maybe a quarter to a third of the public that is paying pretty close attention to the court, and they feel pretty passionate about it. They also feel more divided about the court. They're more evenly split on approval of the court, for example, than the bigger number of folks that don't pay real close attention. So that's one thing. Battles of the court, over the court, really are an affair for the people that are paying the most attention. But the other is, even with the limited attention people pay, they still manage in a rough and ready way to line up their partisan and ideological views with the justices that are more consistent with those views or against the justices that are less on their side. And then on cases, even though those cases can be pretty arcane sometimes, we again find that partisanship of the respondents lines up with feeling good about cases that went in their partisan or ideological direction while opposing cases that went the other way. So in that sense, despite a lack of details, people nevertheless can be said to be understanding the court in that partisan way, though we could argue about whether the partisan or ideological lens is the best way to look at it.
So to wrap things up, we're going to be doing this every 2 months, but we also have a bigger national survey coming out not all that long from now.
No, in about 2 months,
Yeah,
or a little
about
less
2
than
months,
2
yeah.
months now. Our plan is that once a year we will do a larger sample with more questions, and that'll be in September and will be out towards the end of September, as we've done with the previous 2 years. But then 5 months of the year, we'll ask a smaller set of questions, but of about 1,000 respondents nationwide, just like this one. And by repeating the survey frequently, we'll be able to touch on a variety of subjects rather than just be able to ask a set of questions once a year. We'll be able to follow things as they come along. So in September, among other things, we'll take a look at the cases that the justices have already scheduled for argument and decision next year. And that includes some really big blockbuster cases on abortion, among other things, but gun rights and others. And so that's what we'll be following throughout the year.
Sounds good. Professor Charles Franklin, Director of the Marquette University Law School Poll. It's always good to be with you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And thank you for being with us today.